Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Welcome, everybody, to MIT's Faculty Forum Online. I am Joe McGonigal, Alumni Education Director at MIT, and I'll serve as moderator today. We're sponsored by MIT Professional Education and the MIT Federal Credit Union. And a reminder that after we hear from today's guest, we'll field your questions for him. Please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar to ask them, and we'll get to as many as time allows. Joining us today is Marcus Buehler, the McAfee Professor of Engineering at MIT, involved with startups, innovation, and a frequent collaborator with industry. Professor Buehler's primary research interest is identifying and applying innovative approaches to design better materials from less, using a combination of high-performance computing and AI, new manufacturing techniques, and advanced experimental testing. He is the lead instructor of the upcoming MIT Professional Education Short Programs course, Predictive Multiscale Materials Design. We'll post a link to that course along with his full bio in the chat right now. And Professor Buehler, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe, and glad to see so many of you here, including, I think, some of my former students. And I'm very excited to show today what we've been doing the last couple of years and give you an overview of the lab. This is a picture of the lab right before we shut down due to the pandemic. And I'll be highlighting many of the students and postdocs currently in the lab throughout this next hour or so as I go through different topics. So my research deals with multi-scale materials. We look at materials from a multi-scale perspective, beginning at the atomic scale, and we kind of look at a structure that we have at the macro scale, like the Eiffel Tower, for instance, here, through a microscopic lens and go all the way down to the scale of atoms and molecules. And this allows us to model, simulate, and make materials with unprecedented properties because we can engineer all levels in the material. We do this by combining really a lot of different methods and techniques, including theory and computation, as well as experimental work. And you'll see this in the various case studies that I'll show, how the students and postdocs and researchers in my group put these things together in understanding these materials. Many of them are inspired by nature. We have a very big interest in looking at how nature builds sustainable materials. And here you see a picture of a beautiful spider. And of course, spiders are architects, engineers, materials engineers, processing experts, chemical engineers, all of this combined. And they can build amazing structures like these two-dimensional spider webs. But spiders also build three-dimensional web structures like shown here. And if you look at these structures from a macroscopic level, they look more like an architectural object. However, of course, if you go inside the material and you look at the chemical makeup of these materials, you see that these spider silks are made from molecules, proteins in particular, which are really like Lego building blocks that the spider is able to put together in different shapes and patterns and convert the food she has eaten, which looks more like a mess of Lego building blocks, putting these Lego building blocks together in new shapes and forms and creating proteins encoded by DNA, which then lead to these beautiful web structures. And in the last couple of years, we've been able to image and visualize the construction of these web structures quantitatively in the lab. And I'll show more details about this work that Isabelle Su has been doing in the group and later on in the presentation. But you can already see in this movie that we've been able to watch and image the construction process. And this is significant because spiders essentially are 3D printers, nature's 3D printers that can autonomously, intelligently decide where to put material, how to remove material, and use this web structures really as a way to live and catch prey and many other functions. So these kind of three-dimensional web structures made from proteins are quite fascinating because silk has the strength of steel, but a toughness that's much larger than steel. It's very extensible and a really amazing material. But there are many other materials in nature that we're looking at. For instance, recently we've also begun to look at adhesives made from proteins. And one of the famous examples are these muscle adhesion systems. These are remarkable because they're also made from proteins, but they actually utilize organic proteins combined with metal coordinated bonds, forming a new type of bonding that's prevalent in nature and we're just beginning to understand. And one of my current PhD students, Isha, is studying those metallic bonds in proteins in collaboration with my colleague Niels Holten Andersen, who's on the experimental side of this project, where Isha has been able to simulate atomistically the free energy landscape of how these bonding events in these proteins happen and occur, and how they relate to macroscopic levels of toughness. So I'll talk more about these mechanisms during the lecture, but it gives you a really good idea of how we can connect chemistry, the details of chemical bonding, like here we have a multitude of metastable states versus a more smooth energy landscape, and how these relate to macroscopic measurables like toughness or viscoelasticity. Speaking of multiscaling properties, of course, many materials in nature have nanoscopic structuring. We see this in materials like geckos and spiders and flies and beetles, which have very fine hairs at the nanoscale level, which are important to drive size effects and thereby lead to superior adhesion properties without ever using an actual glue or an adhesion chemical. So these are some really interesting phenomena that aren't limited to spiders and insects, other insects, but actually are also found within proteins. And this is some work my former PhD student, Sinan Ketan, who's now a professor at Northwestern, who I think is listening today. Sinan has looked at the size effects in proteins doing his PhD here, and discovered some really remarkable optimizations, adaptations by which proteins are constructed by using universal motifs of confinement to create high strength and high toughness. So these kind of mechanisms of mechanics applied to chemistry through the different scales involved in these materials are very powerful. And my lab has been looking at many different kinds of materials. In other work, we're looking at collagen and bone. On the right-hand side, you see a picture of tendon and bone, and of course muscle tissue, which are also made from proteins, sometimes mineralized and forming some really interesting material systems. On the left-hand side, you see yet another kind of biological systems, a neural network in the brain, which also is a fantastic, interesting, and really amazing biological structure that we're now beginning to build and understand, and of course model and simulate in a simulation. So these biological systems and the way these tissues are constructed is an extremely complicated process. The making part of that involves not only the creation of the protein encoded by DNA, but also the assembly of these proteins. And this happens through a set of sensing and activation processes in which these complex tissues and organs are built. That has been something my lab has been studying for the last couple of years, and we are still trying to push that frontier forward to being able to create synthetic materials like synthetic silks, synthetic organs, skin, hair, and other tissues to mimic what nature has created. But there's much to learn from nature. And one of the things that's interesting about these natural materials is that they're made from very simple chemical building blocks called amino acids. These amino acids form proteins, and these proteins have all these diverse functions. I've showed you a few. An adhesive, a material as strong as steel. You've seen neurons. All of these materials are made from these fundamentally simple chemical building blocks, which are then put together in this natural language of life in different patterns across different length scales and time scales to form all the tissues and all the different materials we know that make up life today. So that's been quite a challenge and an amazing opportunity. Of course, you can see that many different disciplines that come together, and MIT is perhaps the best place in the world to actually address these and research these. And I hope to show you during this next 40, 50 minutes or so how we do that and how we can make some progress there. There 6 different main areas we've been looking at in the last couple of years. One, of course, is we want to understand these biological manufacturing processes. Computing is going to be more and more important. Of course, we have now the College of Computing at MIT, which is really an amazing opportunity for all of us domain experts in materials research and sustainability and biological systems to combine forces with computer scientists in driving the algorithmic application of advanced systems, machine learning, AI. I'll talk a lot about that during the talk. Cloud computing, nano engineering. Of course, MIT Nano is also a facility that we use quite heavily in my research to build materials atom by atom, and augmented reality to be able to visualize and image some of those systems, some of the data we've generated using these molecular simulations or machine learning simulations. And then we want to make these materials, and that's where 3D printing comes in. We're not just looking at the natural 3D printer, the spider, but also, of course, using synthetic human-made spider based 3D printing systems that can autonomously create materials and assemble them. And of course, ultimately, we're interested in making materials a little bit more like us, right? And so materials in our body can repair themselves. We can update ourselves. Of course, we can also get sick. but we also have the ability to repair ourselves. And some of those features of updating a material, changing its function, tailoring the function, and updating it and repairing it are really features of living systems that we're beginning to engineer increasingly into biological, into engineered material systems. And some refer to this as the Industry 4.0 revolution, which involves really an integration of a lot of these different fields of engineering and science, robotics, simulation, the integration of sensors in IoT systems, augmented reality to be able to design things in a very new perspective, additive manufacturing to make materials using a multitude of manufacturing techniques, testing them, letting materials live in the cloud, optimize, collaborate around the world, and ultimately also think about security issues and use big data to optimize and simulate materials and close the loop that way. So these are some of the themes that I've really been excited about in being able to push forward in the last couple of years. This collaborative environment, of course, that we have at MIT with no barriers between departments or schools is really the key for this, including these new initiatives like Schwarzman College, which really open the doors even further. So as we're kind of thinking about these different materials, I just thought I'll ask you all a little bit about what you might be interested in learning about. I know everyone has their favorite biomaterial, and I want to just ask you in the poll, what you're interested in. I mean, we can think about spider silk, conch shells, mussels. I talked about them a little bit already. Geckos, you've seen a picture of geckos and adhesion systems. We have skin with organs, heart, the brain, of course, teeth, chitin, many insects, and tendon, and the list, of course, could be extended. It's not an exclusive list, but those are some of the things we've been thinking about in the lab. And as we're looking at the survey, so thanks all for participating. I'm gonna end the survey in a few seconds. I'm going to see what's your favorite, and hopefully it agrees with what I'm going to be talking about today. If not, then I'll have to come back, of course, in the next couple of years. So I'm going to share the results. So the winner is spider silk. That's a good answer. I think you all picked the right answer here, right? And I will be talking a little bit about spider silk, of course, during the day today. But yeah, but these really just shows, in incredible diversity of functions and materials we have in nature and we can study. And this has been really fun for all my students and me and the postdocs and everyone in the lab to work on these. And so now I'll go to show some case studies and kind of go through some specific things we've done. And I will highlight the individual students that have worked on that are currently in the lab. One topic have in fact been conch shells. That's been one of the winners as well. Not quite a winner, 5%, but some of you were interested in that. So conch shells are one of the toughest ceramic materials in nature. They have these very interesting patternings across different length scales. And the defects of these patterns actually is what makes these materials tough. And so we've been asking the question, how do we design optimal composite structures? And composites essentially are materials where we use a contrasting set of properties, for example, very rigid and very soft. Some of the soft materials might be proteins, the rigid materials might be a mineral, and on their own, these materials might not be very useful. There might be jello and chalk in a classroom, brittle and very duct and very, very flexible. But if you put them together and you arrange them in these very unique patterns across length scales, really from the nano to the macro scale, you can create very high toughness materials like the conch shell. And these defects actually, which we typically avoid as engineers in these biological designs, are actually utilized explicitly on demand to create these superior material functions. So this is a paradigm shift that nature uses. And then we've been asking the question, not only what kind of structures does nature use, but how do these structures actually how are they invented and how are they created? And I already talked a bit about the spider, the construction of the web, the spider being a sensor that senses vibrations and puts down materials, essentially deposits materials after having sensed the environment. We of course have human creativity, and humans are very good in creating all sorts of stuff in the workshop or as an artist or as an engineer. We imagine things, we build them, and we test them. We have this feedback loop. And of course now we're being rivaled or maybe complemented by AI systems, which can actually take the best of both worlds. AI systems can be trained by nature, by natural systems, simulating evolution or simulating the way spiders think and how they process information, and also, of course, interact with humans using virtual reality or augmented reality. And this is something that I'll be talking a little bit about today, how we can bridge this barrier and make AIs partners in creativity and solving problems and designing new materials. So this has been a theme, of course. Now, how do we do that actually? And I want to again mention here that we look at a multi-scale perspective. And To do this in the lab, to do this in a simulation, in theoretical point of views, we need different types of theories. Fundamentally, we use quantum mechanical theories like density functional approaches to simulate the chemistry of atoms interactions, molecular dynamics to simulate the motion of atoms and molecules, coarse graining, which is essentially when we take groups of atoms and put them together in clusters to simplify the computational task, but elegantly scale up through different time and length scales. And of course, we have an effort also in finite element simulations, which is more typical what engineers do in simulating the continuum level. And we also have system level dynamics. Sometimes we want to go to a systems description of how biological systems behave in terms of gene exchanges or evolutionary principles. So those are some of those principles we use, some of the methods we use, and all of this can be combined or complemented by AI methods and machine learning. And this has been a big game changer for my lab because we're able to utilize data sets we either have generated through simulations, physics or chemistry simulations, or data sets collected from experiment to predict complex materials behavior. One of the things I'll be talking about in the first example is, can we use AIs to predict the motion of cracks? And fracture is a topic I've been researching ever since my PhD time back in 2000, 2001. And the propagation of cracks is fascinating because it's a multi-scale problem. When you think about the creation of a crack, well, it can be created in a windshield, for instance. It can be created in the earth in an earthquake. It's sitting there, and at some point it initiates and it propagates. And this initiation process and how it propagates and when it propagates and what are the conditions to actually shut it down are really critical questions for engineers a lot of times. And it's a multi-scale problem in that the individual bonds, the chemical bonds at the tip of this crack are breaking as the crack propagates, but it destroys the entire structure of the material, which is typically a macroscopic object. Could be as big as the Earth, right? That's when an earthquake, we have the shearing of tectonic plates. So these are some of the problems we've been interested in, and we've been trying to see whether we can use AI methods to predict the motion of cracks informed by basically learning the physics of these complex phenomena. And the way this can be applied in practice is to use this as a simulator of evolution. When you have an AI system that can very quickly assess and iterate and evaluate the performance of a particular design, say a protein sequence, or perhaps a composite design, we can very quickly iterate through different design solutions, for example, using genetic algorithms, and then pick the solutions of the design of the sequence of the protein, the chemical structure, or the composite design, and then 3D print them. And so you see in this little movie in the center how that 3D printing works. And multi-material 3D printing is a method we've used extensively in the lab to be able to create at the micro level material compositions that we cannot yet make using conventional manufacturing techniques, but that we can actually create now within just a couple hours using multi-material 3D printing. And this has been exciting because it allows us to directly couple simulation predictions, for example, using AI methods, finite element methods, molecular dynamics methods, directly to the manufacturing field. And then, of course, we can test these materials. So at the basis to these materials designs, I really alluded to that a little bit, is that composites are really patterns. And of course, some computational methods like convolutional neural networks are very good at picking up patterns. In fact, a lot of the image computer vision techniques and image classification or image recognition or segmentation methods that are used in medicine, in autonomous driving, and many other fields of engineering and science can also be applied directly to materials design problems, where essentially these convolutions act as determinations of structures at different magnification levels. So you remember the picture at the very beginning, the Eiffel Tower going from the structural level all the way down to the microscopic level. These convolutions can pick up these different levels of information and link these levels of information to properties. And so we have a hierarchical capturing really naturally through these learning process of the training of the neural network, how microstructures at different length and time scales relate with particular features of the material overall. And so it's a very natural way of doing this. Another way to look at neural networks is to think about using methods to actually generate new solutions. Now, this is an example where we use autoencoders, which essentially is a way of taking a spider web, for example, a three-dimensional code of a spider web, a geometry, encoding this information in a reduced set of variables. We call it coarse graining sometimes in engineering, or finding a reduced set of variables or descriptors, and then build out the structure again from these coarse-grained descriptions. And this is a problem, of course, that many times we want to solve in engineering. We want to simplify the problem, find a solution in a reduced set of space, so we reduce a set of variables, and then come up with a new solution. And this method of using autoencoders is very widely applicable. not only to designs, like for example, designing new types of spider webs and mapping these spider webs onto bridges or other structural designs or composites, but also can be used for proteins. So we use these kind of autoencoder methods in graphs also for protein design. I'll talk about this at the end. This is some work we're doing with the MIT IBM lab that has been a game changer for my lab in being able to use some of the cutting edge advances in computer science, combining them with domain knowledge in proteins and material science that we have in my group. There are many different tools. And this is a field, I think, where right now we're seeing a big revolution going on, where many of these computer science advances are beginning to mingle, intersect with the domain knowledge and creating extraordinary opportunities for advancing how computation can be done at this point. So in practice, how do you do that? Well, one thing you can think about is, so once you have relationships between patterns and features, you can, for example, get them through experiments. You could make 1,000 different composites and you could test them and capture images or videos of these different microstructures and train a neural network to understand these pattern function relationships. But we can also use synthetic data sets. In other words, we can use physics or multi-scale simulations, MD simulations, to capture many different thousands or hundreds of thousands of different microscopic designs and how they relate to functions. So an example is shown here for a couple of data points where we show toughness over crack extension is an R curve. This is how tough the material is and how easy it breaks, how fragile it is, as a function of different design suggestions. This provides the data set, the ground truth that we can use to train the neural network. And then the neural network really learns the relationship between the geometry, which is the distribution of soft and stiff materials over the design domain, and predicting an overall feature or property of this material. In other words, how tough it is. And this method, of course, is very powerful and very efficient, similar to solving games. For example, computers have learned, deep neural networks have learned to play Go very efficiently, which is a very similar problem to the composite design problem, where you have different building blocks that you can move around, and there's an optimal solution. Winning the game in this case means to creating the highest toughness material by distributing these soft and stiff building blocks efficiently over the design domain. And so this has been learned through this data set. And once this is done, of course, we simply give patterns to this computational neural network instead of running a finite element simulation. So traditionally, you run a finite element simulation, and it is a very slow process. It would take billions of years, actually, to solve even a small problem. But machine learning, once it's trained, we can solve this problem very efficiently. And the workflow kind of looks like this, where you begin to have a ground truth data set that we can generate using finite element or molecular dynamics or DFT simulations. We then label the data set to whatever we want to label it. For example, here we're looking at toughness and strength, but you can use many other properties for this. We then teach the machine learning algorithm to understand the patterns, and that could be a pattern. It could be a time series of patterns. It could be 1D pattern, 2D, 3D pattern, and we'll use different kinds of methods in the lab for this. Once trained, the model can be validated, like shown here, for instance. We can show that the toughness and strength predictions agree between the original ground truth, the finite element simulation, and the prediction from the machine learning model. And once that has been trained, we have a very efficient way of predicting strength and toughness. So instead of running a finite element simulation, now all we need to do is to call a neural network, which can be evaluated very quickly on a modern GPU. So the training might be slow, might take a couple of hours or days or maybe even a week or two, but once it's trained, the calling that function, calling the neural network and letting it evaluate is very quick, right? So, and that allows us to combine these methods then with genetic algorithms, so we can simulate the natural evolution. So we use a bio-inspired approach to this AI paradigm, where we can then quickly iterate through different genetic algorithm mutations, assess the evaluation of this, the performance of each design suggestion, and then come up with optimal solutions at the end, which we can then assess and evaluate, looking at these different patterns, and ultimately make them. And we can either make them at the nanoscale. So this is an example of applied these methods to designing tough graphene materials, which are nanomaterials, two-dimensional nanomaterials, by distributing porosities in the design domain. Or we can apply this to composites. Like I've shown earlier, we use multi-material 3D printing in making these kinds of materials as well. And so these kinds of behaviors then validated really close the loop between a very efficient AI algorithm, the making in the lab, the testing in the lab, and collecting new data, which actually could inform the model even more, and could perhaps, using some reinforcement type learning approaches, even improve the machine learning model beyond that. So speaking of these types of phenomena, I think it's fascinating when you think, how much can you actually do with these AI methods? How far can you push this? How predictive can they become? And this is something, of course, we're evaluating and researching actively in the lab. Once we build models, we want to be able to understand how predictive these models can be. And one of the questions we're looking at is, can we actually discover fundamental physical laws? Like for instance, here in this next poll I have on the screen, so please complete the poll and let me know what you think. The question is, can we use AI methods to discover laws like F equal ma without actually ever writing down the equation, and simply by observing variables like Newton observed the apple falling from the tree, and the researcher came up with this model, the differential equation that is the basis to a lot of the engineering we do today, even and so forth. So the question is, can AI methods do that? And I think the majority of you say yes, and that's true. I think in many cases we can actually, because 80% of you thought that in fact you can do this, and I think it's right that we begin to learn these physical laws simply by observation. And one of the areas we're very excited about is to be able to interpret machine learning model, create interpretable, understandable machine learning model that are no longer just a black box that don't tell us anything about what's mechanistically going on, but being able to understand what's going on inside the neural network layers and how the network actually decides and makes observations and decisions. And by doing this, we have the opportunity actually to go back and build models of physical phenomena that are complex. And in the Joe mentioned in the beginning the summer course. In the summer, we actually will go through many different types of codes, many different kinds of neural networks and machine learning methods that are applied to materials design problems and structural problems. Here, I show an example of a code we can actually learn in the summer, where we use variational autoencoders to develop solutions for topology optimization problem, which is a classic problem in engineering, to find optimal solutions for distributions of materials for a truss-like structure. And so these kinds of physics problems can be learned very efficiently using these kinds of methods. So this is very exciting. And it is exciting because we need, in order to build these models, of course, we need the domain knowledge. We need to understand the mechanics, the material science, the chemistry, and all these features to being able to build these models and validate them. So it doesn't mean we don't need conventional physics simulations anymore, but we can enrich them and augment them and complement them and really push the envelope in terms of design and being efficient in coming up with new solutions. Another example I want to show is fracturing. I already indicated that fracturing is one of the passions that I've had for many decades, and something we all do in the lab. And in one way or the other, we look at fracture and failure. We like to break things, I always say, and that's always fun to do. And fracture is this multi-scale problem. So this is some work with my former postdoc, Xiping Zhu, who's now a professor at Tsinghua University. And these kind of multi-scale problems of thinking about an earthquake at the meter scale or kilometer scale, going all the way down to the scale of angstroms, which is really what's happening when the atomic bond break between silicon or silica in the earth, for instance, or in a metal or a polymer or in a protein. We have these multi-scale phenomena happening. And of course, fracturing is something that engineers are very concerned with even today. One example here, you might remember that a couple of years ago, Tesla introduced a new vehicle, and it was supposed to be fracture resistant. And so the demo on stage, which was perfectly staged, the guy threw a rock at the car, and hoping, of course, the rock wouldn't break the window. That was the promise. And of course, the crack started to propagate. And you can see that I think they fixed it now, right, at Tesla. But these kind of fracture prevention phenomena are really important, not just for this demonstration, but really for any engineering problem and medicine problem and structural problem. If you want to build an implant for your heart, you want to implant for tissues or organs, they have biological functions, but they also have a mechanical integrity function, because we need to have an actual material that withstands the mechanical deformations that our body undergoes. And this holds true for pretty much any property, including electronics and electronic devices and wearables, where you need to think about the mechanics of the materials. And so we're very interested in understanding as engineers how to predict the fracturing, how to prevent fracturing from happening. We saw two movies here. On the right-hand side is a protein, a crack in a biological tissue. Left-hand side, you saw a crack in silicon. And these kind of fracture phenomena are fascinating, because at the tip of the crack, we have these singularities, very large stresses, the breaking of bonds, and we have this large-scale structural failure that might occur from these. And this problem is tough, because it deals with chemistry, mechanics, and integration of these, and potentially even an integration of multiple time scales. We think about viscoelastic materials. And so we've been thinking about how to do that using an AI method. And the reason is very simple. The motivation for this is very simple, that simulating fracturing is very expensive, and it takes a lot of time to do that computationally. It could take you a day, a week, or weeks even to do that if you do a high resolution simulation, like an atomistic simulation. So Johnny, my postdoc, who is shown on the right-hand side on the top, has been looking at this problem. And Johnny has thought about a way of creating a data set, a training set to teach an AI system to remember, to predict how cracks propagate. And the way we do this is we start very similar as we've done before. We have a training set that basically consists of observations of crack propagations in many different material configurations, many different crack orientations, different crystal orientations, different boundary conditions, obtained by molecular dynamics simulations. So we simulate atom by atom how these cracks propagate, and then use this data set to train a machine learning model to learn these relationships. So this is very similar to looking at apple falling from the tree and trying to come up with a description of what happens under different scenarios, different boundary conditions, initial conditions, and so forth. And this is what we're doing here as well for the problem of fracture. And so the data set looks like this. There are hundreds and thousands of different types of simulations done. Here's shown a picture of 9 of them, but you can kind of see that we're feeding a lot of information, a lot of data on how these cracks propagate over time. Now, these are time sequences of fracturing events. We're interested in the time, the temporal evolution now, and we're feeding this to a neural network. This particular type of neural network doesn't just have convolutional layers, which recognize patterns at different magnifications that I've talked about earlier, but now we're actually looking at the time series. We use a method called an LSTM, which basically is a way of remembering the history of how systems evolve. And this is, of course, perfectly suited to simulate physical phenomena like fracturing and many other things like this. And the model is actually able to learn very well how this works. You can see on the right-hand side is probably the most illustrative plot, comparing the MD simulation prediction with the AI prediction, and you can see that the orientation dependence of how the crack changes as you change the orientation is very well reproduced. We can use this model not only for situations we have trained it against, which is, of course, good that it works, but it's not enough. We want to be able to be predictive. We can also apply this to situations that we have not trained for. And an example here would be gradients. So we have a gradient here, a continuous variation of microstructure. And that is a situation that the model has not seen during the training, but can actually describe very well how cracks propagate in a situation like this, describe the branching of cracks and the stopping of cracks. And this is an example where we picked a few really interesting situations where we see some unique phenomena like the stopping, the arrest of crack, or the deflection of crack at, for example, twin grain boundaries. And we've been able to simulate this using molecular dynamics. So we went back and we actually simulated this system using full atomistic simulations and show that the machine learning prediction, which has never seen a situation like this, agrees actually with the prediction from the MD simulation, which is the ground truth. So that's really simulating the physics of every single atom. So it's very powerful. And we went on and actually looked at many different systems, including my current student, Andrew Liu, as a student, actually a PhD student from chemistry. And Andrew has been looking at chemically complex materials like graphene and others. And he applied this machine learning technique to those systems and looked at fracturing in graphene. And you can see in graphene, of course, we have a much more difficult distribution of fracturing happening. The microstructure is more complex, and we have different chemical complexities involved here as the bonds break and stretch. And we've been able to actually show for that system as well, we can train a neural network very well again here and predict fracturing processes. And you can see the MD fracture paths and the average paths, comparing this with the observation between MD and machine learning. They agree very well and can validate essentially the predictions from that. And we can look at design suggestions again. We can look at grain boundaries between different microstructures and understand how branching happens. And branching, of course, you remember the composite example earlier, we want to have branching so that the crack doesn't just go straight. We want to have the crack to go in many different directional changes, so we have tortuosity of the crack, which leads to high fracture toughness. So this is a design objective that we can now implement very efficiently. So instead of running a simulation here that takes weeks or maybe even months, potentially, depending on the resolution simulation, we can now run the simulation within a couple of microseconds, make predictions, and then perhaps pick the kind of solutions we want to study in more detail and run full atomistic simulations for these. Another example has been the prediction of fields. So we can not only predict the evolution of cracks, but we can actually go one level lower even and predict the distribution of stresses and strains in the material. And so these are the origins, of course, of fracturing I mentioned already earlier is the singularity. And so here we have a method now developed by this student, Zhenze Yang, who this paper actually will appear in I think a week or so, and I think will be on MIT News, so you can check it out then in a little more detail. So Zhenze has developed this really, really interesting technique where we can predict for composites again, for distribution of soft and stiff materials, multiple materials, the distribution of stress and strain fields in the system. And this replaces essentially what's conventionally done using finite element simulations. We can do indentation problems and predict complex residual stresses and predict, again, fracturing, right? So you can see here, you can simulate the propagation of cracks. Now, in this case here, the evolution of the crack actually is predicted solely based on the stress field. And so we're really truly replacing a simulation like a finite element simulation or molecular dynamics simulation and predicting which bonds will break because of the stress field distribution. So we have the whole picture now. And we have a second paper that we just submitted where we do a systematic comparisons with continuum mechanics theory. So those of you who are maybe in course 1, 2, or 3, or others, you might have studied continuum mechanics, and continuum mechanics is a powerful framework that has a lot of analytical solutions for stress fields around cracks and inclusions, like Eshelby inclusion problems. And we've been able to demonstrate this neural network has learned very well how these solutions can be predicted without actually ever learning these problems or learning the equations. It's purely from observing a training set, understanding the physics, and can be able to generalize these observations. So it's very exciting as a way of complementing what we can do already with mechanics and being able to do designs. So I'm going to shift gears now. The next, the remainder of the talk, the next 10, 50 minutes or so, I'll be going back to proteins that I began with, actually. I began with proteins, and one of the really amazing things is that are these spider webs, right? We have studied them in many different ways in our lab, in theory, in simulation, in experiment. And in the last several years, we've had a whole group of students and postdocs working with real spiders and real spider webs. This is our collaborator, Tomas Saracino, who's actually a visiting artist at CAST, the Center for Art, Science, and Technology, who I work with closely in many different projects. And my former student and postdoc, Jiao Jin, who's now Syracuse University, who might also be listening. Tomas is an architect and an artist who brought spiders to us, and we have been watching various spiders build webs and image them. And this is a group of students that have followed Jiao's initial work, actually, is Isabel and Nyosha. Isabel, PhD student, she just graduated. Nyosha is an undergrad student. And they have been looking at developing a technique to image and visualize the building, the construction of these web structures. And the movie that I showed at the onset of the talk actually was made by Isabel and watching a spider build the web. And the way we do this is we have a sheet laser that essentially runs through the web, scans the web layer by layer, and then reconstructs the web structure, three-dimensional web structures in a computer algorithm to then build a network model, a graph essentially of the web structure, which leads to a three-dimensional model. And the way the scanning looks like, if you actually go through the scanning in a dark room, this is sort of how it looks like. So the laser will light up sections of the web, and we can use this data to reconstruct. Isabel has been supported by MathWorks, one of those new MathWorks fellowships, which has enabled her to do this work with MATLAB, which is the software we've been using to create these kind of algorithms, and then using these scanning data scanning data sets to then reconstruct a three-dimensional web, which is this one here, right? So this is the computer model now of that same web structure, which has integrated a lot of this data. So quite complicated problem, but very exciting, because now this is the first ever three-dimensional model of a 3D spider web, which are actually the most common webs. Usually we look at this as a cobweb and we kind of ignore them, but actually, as you can see, there are a lot of really interesting structural features in this web structure. And Isabella's been interested in looking at how to utilize this and extract them for engineering designs. I've also been interested in observing spiders build these webs. This is actually a student from the Mini Europe and Super Europe program, which some of you know of, which has been really exciting to involve undergrad students, either in a very short period in Mini Europe and IEP, or then for a whole year in the Super Europe program, which we have had many students in the lab in this program. He has been looking at how spiders build three-dimensional spider webs under vibrational boundary conditions, so in other words, simulating environmental conditions like continuous shaking of the web structure. And of course, we can also utilize silk, various kinds of silk materials, and 3D print them and make them into other things, like a spring here for electronics applications. So there's really a multitude of opportunities as engineers to either study the natural system like the spider web, or to make materials, like in this case, we've made some very, very resilient materials that can be exposed to very cold temperature. You saw that here, this is liquid nitrogen. and yet retaining extensibility. And so this is one of the amazing features of the kinds of materials we can engineer based on silk. We can 3D print them. This is something that we have been doing as well, to print the actual three-dimensional web structures and replicate them in the lab, visualize them, and actually digitize these web structures and build what we call digital twins. And so this is an application of virtual reality or augmented reality, where we can then begin to interact with the web using these AR glasses or AR systems. One of the applications of this actually is in MIT Nano, where we have built an installation of this to utilize these virtual reality setups as an instrument. So now you might think, well, how can we convert a spider web into a musical instrument? Well, you think about a musical instrument, a lot of them involve strings and membranes, which you can pick and vibrate, and they make a sound. And in this case, of course, a spider web, if you think about having a model of the spider web in a computer and using virtual reality, you can wander around the web and you can actually pick on a string and you can excite it and you can listen to it. And we've created this 1,000-string harp and experimented with that and actually created a musical ensemble, which is led by Ivan Zapurin, professor in music, and also involved with cast, of course, and others who have performed with Isabel, the PhD student I mentioned earlier, really around the world in creating this new musical performance based on the spider web. And so this work, of course, has been related and done in collaboration with Tomás Saraceno. In fact, we had the honor of performing this inaugurally at Tomás's exhibition in Paris at the Palais de Tokyo in his on-air exhibition, and supported by CAST, has provided an immense opportunity to educate not only engineers and scientists, but also non-engineers and artists about the utilization of materials and structural engineering in creating new kinds of musical instruments. More on the structural side, I had a student last year, she graduated actually in the spring, Asia Heckel, an MN student, who developed bridge designs from these spiderweb structures. So she worked with Isabel and the other students in the group in taking the data and utilizing some of the segments, some of the structures found in the three-dimensional web that I've shown earlier, and creating new structural engineering designs, which is very exciting as well. So this is a footbridge design that could be built maybe one day at MIT. We're going to build it across the Charles River. You can maybe come back next year and it'll be there. And it could be a new way of course, inspiring architectural solutions, both aesthetically, but also from a perspective of creating superior structural performances. And when we think about proteins, one topic we haven't really touched upon too much yet is the really basic level of amino acids. I mentioned at the very beginning, Sinan's work in the group has opened up this field in my lab to think about how structural designs, mechanical properties can be related to sequence patterns in amino acids. And this work has continued, and in the group we have an active effort in predicting sequence relations between the genetic level, the amino acid sequences, folding proteins, and predicting functions. And for this, we very heavily rely on the universality of vibrations and waves, which, of course, in molecules, we have the wave-particle duality of quantum level objects. In sound, things we can hear, we have the superposition of waves as well, many sine waves to create voice and language and music and other kinds of expressions. And of course, spiders communicate through vibrations in their web. So their web structure isn't just a harp for us, but it's actually their own instrument to sense the environment and make decisions about how to build a new web and how to sense prey in collections. And vibrations and waves is something we've been very fascinated by in the lab. We've looked at all sorts of wave patterns in water waves. We've looked at wave patterns in flames, in fire. And of course, we've considered how these kind of wave patterns in the creation of sound work. And so this is a more classic example of how we use wave patterns in strings that are vibrating, exciting air pressure waves, which our auditory system can pick up, and we hear it as sound. So that's sort of traditional way how musical instruments work. But we have begun to build models of molecules also from this molecular perspective using vibrations. And so you think about a molecule like this, a benzene ring, it really isn't static. So if you open a textbook, you're going to see a benzene picture, right? You remember from your chemistry classes. This is not how these molecules actually look like. If you take a microscope and you look at what they actually are, they're going to look more like this. They're continuously vibrating and moving. And these vibrations, of course, create a sound. And we can actually create audible expressions of these by transposing these very high frequencies of these molecular vibrations into the audible range. And then we can compare them with musical expressions. And one of the things we're interested in is understanding how sequences of letters or abstractions in language relate to the language that nature speaks in the creation of DNA and proteins. And this is a score from Beethoven. And if you look at these scores, you're going to see a lot of really interesting repetitions, right? So there's different motifs, repetitions, rhythms, and the same thing happens in proteins. If you look at protein sequences in silk, for instance, those of you who work on silk and collagen proteins and many other proteins, there are motifs that are repeated, and they're repeated all over. They're repeated through evolution, different species, or within the protein itself. And so we have formalized this in a series of papers, actually going back, I think the first paper came out in 2011, using category theory in collaboration with mathematics. So this, again, is highlighting the amazing place MIT is in being able to collaborate with all sorts of departments, mathematics, and this time with David Spivak. Then I had a student a couple of years ago, Sebastian Verjou, who's shown in the middle here. Sebastian is a music major at MIT, an undergrad. He was a Europe student in my lab for about a year, and he developed a syntax mapping of functional relationships between proteins, the way proteins are built on the right-hand side, and the way music is built. And we can actually use these grammars and compare them between music and proteins. And so this is, for example, what you can do that for music. You can do the same thing for proteins here for Bach, for instance. And this way of thinking about proteins and vibrations is very, very important, as another student has shown. This is Yiwen, who is a current PhD student in my group. And Yiwen has actually made a very striking discovery. So she looked at the coronavirus spike protein. And all of you have heard about the coronavirus, of course, and the spike protein in particular, because this is where the vaccines attack. This spike is what attacks our human cells. And the vaccines and antibodies, of course, they interact with the spike in most cases to prevent the infection or actually shut down the infection once it has occurred. And so Yiwen began to look at the vibrational spectrum of these coronavirus proteins. And we've looked at many different types of species of coronaviruses, from COVID-19, the current one, SARS and MERS, as well as mutants of COVID-19, which couldn't be more timely right now, as we're all talking about the different mutants spreading around the world. And what she's discovered actually is that this molecule isn't static, right? It can be visualized as an animation like shown here, but you can also hear it. If you want to hear it, you can check it out online. You can Google it. There's an MIT news story about this as well. You can hear each amino acid sequence, each different mutations of this protein, each different version of this coronavirus has a different sound, and you can see it clearly here, how it moves differently. And these kind of nanoscopic strings, the bonds between atoms and how they move collectively, relates directly to the lethality of these different species of coronaviruses and the infectiousness. And this is something that we had a first paper come out last year in Cell Matter. And we've already shown the correlation between different coronavirus species. And then Yiwen is actually currently working on a follow-up paper where she's looked at many different mutations which have emerged. Since this paper came out, we had an abundance of new mutations, new measurements of infectiousness and lethality. And we've been able to build a model to predict these straight from the mechanical vibration. So thinking about these viruses as a vibrating object has been very powerful. But it doesn't actually end here. There's a lot more we can do. If we're interested in building new proteins from scratch, we have really a very powerful opportunity to relate structure, function, and sound or music in this way. And so again, proteins are these collections of DNA letters realized in amino acids built into this three-dimensional folder geometry. And we found that each of these building blocks of DNA and amino acids have a unique sound associated with them from the chemistry. So we're not just assigning a sound based on the letter, we're actually formally studying the chemical formations of these different building blocks. And what you just heard was what we call the amino acid scales. So these are all the tones these different amino acid building blocks make as we build music from these proteins. And we can understand proteins and their functions similar to musical creation. So what you hear in the background is some classical music playing. And when you think about the creation of proteins, right, they form from amino acids, secondary structures, bundles, fibers, web structures, and so on. Music is created in a very similar way, of course. You break it down into sine waves. We have different instruments for modulating the sine waves, overlaying sine waves. Then we can play different pitches. We can play chords, chord progressions. We can play melodies, counterpoint. We can make an orchestra, like shown, like you can hear in the background, many different instruments playing together, creating a web of interactions. And these webs are very similar, of course, to what we see in protein structures. And proteins, this is just an example of this very simple alpha helicoprotein. This protein is like a vibrating string, right? And so it has a sound with it. I'm not playing the sound here, but you can hear it, like I said, online. There's a lot of examples there. We can then build models of proteins as a vibrational system. And what that means is we can encode the entire information about the structure, the folding, the interaction between the protein, the function, as an audible spectrum or a change of audible spectrum over time. So it's a time history of how the sound evolves, which some of us can call music, or you can call it sound, or for an AI, it could be just a training set. And this is in fact the application for this, is to build training sets. So in AI, and machine learning, one of the really big challenges is what kind of data do you use to train it, and how do you create the data set, and how do you label the data set? And so this way of coding information about proteins, the language of life, into an audible spectrum or a spectrum of evolving frequencies of time is a perfect way, or one of the powerful ways, I would say, to encode information about how proteins actually are built and work. So we've been able to create neural networks that can listen to a lot of proteins. And what we've done is basically we took thousands and hundreds of thousands of different proteins, made them into music, and then played this music to an AI system. And the AI system can then make up their own proteins, right? So it can create new protein systems, new protein sequences that nature has not yet invented. And so we can kind of have a different pathway to evolution in creating now, instead of a new sequence by just making up numbers or letters, by creating music that follows the patterns, particular patterns that these letters need to follow in order to create a particular type of functional protein. And so this is where the secret lies in how nature evolves proteins. There are certain patterns and rhythms, interactions, and folds that need to be satisfied in order to create an actual fundable, foldable, and functional protein. And the AI can learn that through this musical coding. So we've done this and essentially let the AI create a new song, if you wish, and a new musical piece. And we can then convert that protein back into a DNA sequence, that music back into a DNA sequence, give the DNA sequence into an organism like E. coli, make the protein in these biological machineries, and then splice them, and open them up and extract them and purify them. And so what you see on the right-hand side are proteins made through music. So this is, I think, the first time that we have made, anyone has made a new protein that nature has not yet evolved naturally through evolution, purely based on the invention of music. So this is very exciting. And one of the things I always ask at this point is, if you've heard a little bit about, I've talked a little bit about COVID and sonification and how these sound like. The next poll, I want to ask you, what kind of music comes out of these different proteins? So you think about a protein that's very strong, or you think about a protein like in a virus that's very dangerous or lethal. What kind of music do they make? Do they make music that's pleasant or dramatic or has a lot of dissonances? And of course, that's I think a very deep foundational question of what we're looking for. So I see that most of you say tough and healthy proteins sound pleasant. I'm gonna end the poll at this point, but I think that can be misleading, right? So, and the reason is that the objective function for these proteins, the way they're created and designed, isn't necessarily to make the music sound pleasant, right? That's just our expectation. And so, in fact, when you listen, if you Google online the sonification of the coronavirus spike protein that our lab has created, it sounds very beautiful, and it is one of the most devastating proteins, of course, that we've ever come across, at least in terms of the effect on the world. The reason is, of course, that the music codes the structure of the protein, the regularity, the repeat, which are all the features I've tried to explain earlier in music, which make us interpret the sound as pleasant. And it not necessarily has a relationship to the actual function of this protein. So it's more of a question of how the protein is designed. But we can, by understanding what to look for, the AI algorithm can look for things like stability or lack of stability, and then find that. And this is where I think the AI can be powerful as a way of complementing the kinds of things that humans can do, because we are biased essentially by expecting certain types of sounds based on cultural training to expect certain types of pleasant music or not so pleasant music. And of course, proteins don't follow this rule at all. And this is a subject of research we're currently engaging in as well. Another thing we've done is we've put this into orchestral score. This is a protein that we have, or actually interaction of two proteins of the virus spike with the antibody, which was just decoded a couple of months ago. And this was put in an orchestral score and actually performed by an orchestra in Korea. And you can also find out a little bit more about that if you like online. And this is sort of an illustration of how we can not only utilize the innate sounds of the protein, which I played earlier, which sound kind of strange, but actually you can map this also onto conventional Western classical musical instruments and other instruments and play it in an orchestra, for instance. There's also an app you can download for free on Android. It's the Amino Acid Synthesizer, it's called. You can find it there. And you can actually play this keyboard of the 20 amino acids yourself and design your own proteins. You can see how I'm actually designing a protein sequence on the bottom and you can download that and then see what kind of melodies you've created and what kind of protein functions that might be. You can look for that in the genetic databases. And the last example before we end is I want to just talk a little about other features we can predict. We can not only predict the structure in a very abstract way, like in music, but we can also predict specific functions like stability using neural networks. This is some recent work on collagen where we've predicted the stability as a functional sequence. And I want to illustrate the exciting thing about this is that we can very quickly go through many different mutations now within very, very short time scale. This is some work that actually Isha is involved in that, and Johnny, and also Mario Milazzo, postdoc in the group, and looking at these collagen. And the last thing I want to mention, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, is the folding. This is this project that we have with IBM, where we're predicting an end-to-end folding system, where we're trying to fold proteins from the sequence and also predicting features. Like in collagen, we've predicted the thermostability. I want to be able to predict a building plan. And so this method, the way it works is it takes in a sequence, as a sequence, and it builds a building plan like for an IKEA shelf. So you go to IKEA, you buy some furniture, you get 1,000 pieces, right? And you get a building plan, a manual, and it tells you how to put them together. And this is what we're creating. So the AI algorithm gives us a building plan of how these amino acids are actually put together and folded in three-dimensional space. An end-to-end model in that sense, predicting the folding. And this is work by Zhao, was involved in that as well, and a current postdoc, Kai Guo, and other students in the group are helping out with that as well, predicting these simulations of these proteins. The application of this actually are food coatings, and this is work, but the other co-PI in this project is Benedetto Mavelli, my colleague in the department. And Benedetto is interested in food security. You might have heard of him. He's a really amazing colleague, and he's an expert in using biomaterials as a way of creating sustainable food coatings. So instead of using plastic around food like strawberries, we want to use proteins, and that's what he does in his lab. And so we're joining team here, us doing the theory and the folding, the protein design, and him doing the experimental side, and IBM. Of course, we're working with IBM to do the machine learning and folding these proteins. And this has been exciting to put together also experimentally. This is some work we're doing in our lab in building 1, 3rd floor. So we're not there right now. Actually, some of the postdocs are back in students, a few of them, but hopefully soon you'll be able to walk by and you can look inside. There's our BL2 lab, where students and postdocs are working very hard in putting together these new methods, especially here, Sabrina and Xingfei and Talia, in predicting and developing methods to convert biomass, waste streams like sewage sludge, wood, chitin, fish waste, into functional materials like composites. And this project, this work is very exciting because it sort of simulates the entire process that I've talked about in this whole talk today, in imagining how we have some organism eating a fly, breaking down the building blocks and recreating this in a new way and creating composites out of that and printing them. And the application is, one of the applications is wood-based composites to create alternatives for formaldehyde-based adhesives. So with that, I'm going to end here, maybe with this slide, and just mention that this all of the work you've seen covers multiple scales, and we tweak them, we design them, and create superior materials from that are not only better in performance, but also are more sustainable and can be built less expensively from really inexpensive ingredients. So I hope we have a little bit of time for questions now. Thank you.
Professor Buehler, Marcus Buehler, thank you again. A really nice overview of your current portfolio of research from your lab. Alumni with questions, there's plenty in the Q&A tool. Feel free to submit others there, those still tuning in. Jay asks, please, go back to the conch shell, talk about the defects that make the material stronger. That was curious.
Great question. And I didn't have a lot of time to explain that, but now I have an opportunity to explain in more detail. So when you think about a perfect material, and imagine a perfect material without any defect, and you put a little crack in there. And I should mention, any material you have in nature or in engineering or anything you build, it always has some defects built in, right? So you always have some potential crack in there. And you can imagine this being in a windshield, in an airplane, in a train, in your car, in a building, in a structure. So the question is, what happens around that crack that might be emerging? So in a perfect material, we develop a perfect singularity. So meaning the stresses become infinitely large at the tip of the crack, and very small away from the crack. And this is a situation that's potentially very, very dangerous and threatening, because once the crack begins to nucleate, it will begin to spread, and there's no way to stop the crack. Catastrophic failure. So what happens when you have a composite like in the conch shell is you have a different paradigm. You don't avoid the creation of these damages at all. In fact, you allow that, you welcome the damages. But what you do is you create weak paths and you force the crack to dissipate energy in many different directions. You imagine having a brick and mortar structure. Every intersection between the bricks and the mortars is an interface that can break more easily. And so the crack will be forced to propagate in a very tortuous path. So it won't go just straight. It actually will continuously go left and right and left and right. And in fact, actually will spread out in a very large region called the damage zone. And the damage zone means that there's much more energy dissipation per unit volume than if you have a singular crack that can only propagate along one path. And so it does a couple of different things. One, it makes it more difficult energetically to make a crack actually propagate through the material. And it also makes it less catastrophic when it happens, because you allow fracturing to happen all the time, but just not enough to break the entire material. And this is the paradigm we see implemented in nature in these biological composites, including the conch shell. It's a very powerful way of creating very resilient and very, very robust materials.
I'll try to sneak in 2 more questions here. Art asks, using a library of algorithms and materials, can you build an assembly machine that can build products with desired properties?
Yeah. So we have done that, and I showed a little bit, but I went probably very, very, very quickly through that. So exactly, these kind of machines work in that way, in that we have an evaluator, which is usually a machine learning model that evaluates how a particular design, it could be a protein sequence or it could be a composite design, performs. And another algorithm that makes mutations or changes to that design, like a genetic algorithm. And they work hand in hand. So the genetic algorithm will mutate the structure, make slight variations, and the evaluator, the machine learning model, will evaluate very quickly how well the system performs, and then we can optimize and adapt the structure. So this is what happens when nature discovered these conch shells, these patterns we just talked about. This is how they were discovered over thousands and thousands of billions of years in some cases, like in spiders and silks. They've been around for a long time. So these systems evolve like this, and we can now simulate that, of course, in much, much more rapid succession. We can simulate many different generations of materials designs, and then we can make them, right? So we can then 3D print them. And there's variations of this. We can make them and test them. We could optimize them fully and then make them and test them. And those are some of the research directions we're exploring right now, is how interactive we can make that, or how autonomous we can make that, right? So if you have a system that can autonomously make materials and measure them and test them, and then make changes, you don't need any human intervention or very little human intervention, right? So the system learns from itself, by itself, through the actual physical performance of the system that's being printed. And this is, I think, very exciting, very promising.
Let me try to sneak in some quick yes or no's, maybe rapid fire here. Do the spider web-like structures lead to better ways to combine reinforcing fibers in composite matrices like graphite epoxy?
Great question. The answer is not a yes or no. I don't know, to be honest. But there are some features that we see in there that are, so first of all, the spider web is not optimized for one thing, right? It's a sensor, a vibrational sensor for the spider to live in and to catch prey, to localize the prey. There's a lot of signal transduction adaptation in there. It needs to live in there and have a home there. Some spiders live in those webs, some don't, some share the webs of the structure. So there's a lot of different things. So what we need to do actually is to focus on particular regions of the web, like the tent or the tunnel or the sparse web. And that's what Asia did. And her taking the web structure and building a footbridge from it, she did that. So she picked certain regions and tried to see what are the performance characteristics we have, in this case for structural performance, and then she adapted those and optimized them a little bit further to predict optimal structural performance. So it's not as simple as yes or no, unfortunately, but there's definitely some interesting things to be learned that are more general. I think I didn't mention this explicitly, but and that is in the way these structures are built. So the spider is this incredible 3D printer, but it does it without any support materials. All of you who work in 3D printing know that there's a little, the secret, of course, of 3D printing is that many methods require what's called support material. And support material means that there's stuff that you print to support against gravity what you make, and you have to remove it. And of course, spiders don't have that. They have no scaffolding. They have no support material. They're intelligent. The print head is built into the spider itself, right? And so I think there's some generic lessons I think learning to be learned by watching the spider make these complex web structures, which I think is much more transferable than, say, a particular structural design, which is the obvious one you think about. But I think there's more general insights that we can learn from watching the way spiders actually build these web structures.
Boris asks, can you destroy certain proteins by playing a certain type of music, destructive interference with the protein's natural vibration frequency? Can you cure viral infections at a concert hall?
Yeah, well, so I want to mention here, this is a great question too. The frequencies, I did mention that we transpose the frequencies. Of course, the frequencies in a molecule are very high, and to make them audible, we make them audible to be able to process them in our brain, right? I work with CAST, and I'm interested in advancing the way we can create music from an artistic perspective, but also to use music as a way, using part of our brain essentially, to come up with new protein designs, which is a very difficult language to speak, right? We don't really know how to speak that yet. And we believe that that transforming it into music helps us with this abstraction to solve that problem, mathematically, essentially converting it. But and so by doing this, you don't necessarily have the same frequencies that will actually excite the protein. But the question is a great one, and I think we have an opportunity to think about that. And as long as we're able to excite the right frequencies, it wouldn't happen in a concert hall probably, because those frequencies are much lower than what you have in your body or in a virus. But we are working with a group at Lincoln Labs actually to come up with a way, in MGH, we have a team formed that we are trying to figure out ways of actually exciting the right frequencies for proteins, including specifically the virus proteins, to potentially destroy them. And of course, if you have the ability to excite some of those normal modes and resonances, yeah, you can break them. In some of my talks, I show the example of an opera singer breaking the glass. You're doing this by singing at the right frequencies to excite the right kind of mechanical informations and then essentially break the glass that way without ever touching the glass. And I think that's what your question is getting to. And this we believe it could be done potentially. But yeah, we'll have to be able to apply the right frequencies at the right point in the body or in the air if we have viruses in the air and in the environment. And there's a lot of technology and research needs to be done to do that. But it is definitely an exciting direction, especially since we know that each of these proteins and spikes in COVID-19 pathogens, for instance, are very particular in terms of their frequency distribution. So they're unique, and we can identify them and target them, fingerprint them very precisely. And it would mean essentially what I think is very interesting about this is it's a non-chemical approach to potentially looking at diseases. And if you, of course, you can treat a disease like COVID with a vaccine, antibodies essentially, but it's a drug. It's a foreign chemical that you put in your body. Using mechanical vibrations, which is really all biology uses mechanics in a way to interact, communicate, build networks, speak to each other. Molecules, I would say, communicate and speak to each other through vibrations. We know that. And the docking and all these things are happening at certain level frequencies. So yeah, if we can interfere with that in a non-chemical way, yeah, it would open a whole new direction in medicine potentially. But yeah, I want to emphasize, this is a very complicated challenge in actually getting those kind of actuations of frequencies into the tissue and being able to control where to put them precisely. So it's not a solved problem, but yeah, I think definitely something worth to explore.
Thank you, and thanks for that great question, Boris. We will leave it there today. That was a great crash course. I think I need to watch that at half speed when I watch it again, because you certainly got a mouthful in there, Professor Buehler. Alums can spend a week with you this summer, get a lot more packed into that week in the MIT Professional Education short course. We'll send all registrants more info about that course as well. And thanks again to Professor Marcus Buehler. It was MIT Faculty Forum online broadcast with him today. We'll post a recording of this on the MIT Alumni Association YouTube channel. We'll send Professor Buehler a list of all the questions and contact info of those who asked them. And we'll keep the chat window open today on the Zoom call for additional discussion if you want to stick around. Thanks again to everybody for participating today. And thanks, Professor Buehler.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.